So one of the things about evolution is that it is the foundation of all of biology. Everything that happens in biology revolves around evolution. The reason why I think biology is so cool is because it's always changing, right? We know that with this COVID. Every day, new stuff is coming out, new research is being posted. People with the vaccine, this happens. People without the vaccine, this happens. Oh, now we know this, now we know that, now we know this, now we know that. And so that's because the virus, for example, is evolving. That's because cancers evolve. That's because organisms evolve. And so we're going to talk about the basics of evolution today and why we call evolution a theory and what is a theory. Okay, so just based on like communications between people, ideas about evolution goes back at least 2,500 years, goes back to a lot of the philosophers. And if you think about it, like, well, philosophy and science, the philosophers were philosophizing or talking about and thinking about ideas about science. And one of the things that they started talking and thinking about were, how did things come about? How come some things are similar and some things are different? So they started to talk about all of that. So we're going to look at some of the ideas. So this Greek philosopher, Anaximander, right? Remember that in case you have kids. Name your first kid Anaximander. Anaximander had a really good idea about evolution that we still know holds true today. That life started out as simple and eventually changed or evolved into complex. And so that kind of makes good sense, right? You can't get something complex unless it starts with some basic foundations. And that's true for pretty much anything. If you're going into engineering, you start with simple things and then you build on it, right? So we always start simple to complex, and that's true for evolution. Really basic foundation, very important. So Aristotle, famous philosopher, he had an idea about this fixed species concept. He thought that organisms were put on the earth in one form and they never changed. They were fixed. We know that's not true. We know over time, we're going to talk a lot about natural selection and how that based on the environment, certain traits or characteristics have more advantage in that environment, and organisms with those traits have an easier time surviving. Organisms without those traits die off, so that we do see the percentage in a population changes based on the environment. Natural selection, nature selects for those with the best traits in the environment right now. So that can change things over time. He also thought about this ladder of nature in terms of the perfection of organisms, and that certain organisms were more perfect than others. Look who we put at top. I don't know. I mean, you know, they always say cockroaches will survive everything. Plants. Do you ever see like a house or something that's been abandoned and there's plants all over it, right? So as soon as the humans move out, other things in nature move in and take advantage. So I don't know that I would probably put humans way lower. That's just me. But he felt this was the superiority of organisms ladder. I think it's interesting now that he put plants at the bottom when these are the very things, especially us as humans, rely on for food and oxygen that are critical to our survival. How could they be lower than us? I don't know. All right. There's another guy, George S. Buffon. In the mid-1700s, George S., he had the idea that fossils were remnants of ancient living things, that when a living thing died, what was left behind was called a fossil. So we do know that that is true today. Based on Buffon studying fossils, he found fossils that were similar yet different and said, this organism looks like this organism, This organism's higher up in the soil, and it has better characteristics for the environment, so maybe I can see how this one died off earlier than this version later. And again, we know that's true today. So this is really cool. Long time ago, there was this organism called the glyptodont, about the size of your car. It is a remnant and a relative of the armadillo. A lot of people think that in evolution, things always go from small to big, but that's not necessarily true. Here we have the case of something going from big in size to small. The environment, when dinosaurs or after the dinosaurs perhaps were around, plants were way bigger, right? Everything was way bigger then. So it might make sense that organisms like dinosaurs or the glyptodont were way bigger. Now, it is much more of an advantage because, bless you, plants are smaller, that this can hide better in its environment, doesn't need to eat as much because the plants are smaller, so it doesn't have as much food. So the advantage is to be smaller in size. Pretty interesting. Lyell also studied evolution in the 1800s, studied fossils, and what Lyell suggested, and this was like crazy idea, he said the Earth was older than even 6,000 years. So back then, in the 1800s, people still thought the Earth was probably about 2,000 years old. And he was like, I think it's 6,000. And people were like, no. And he's like, well, 6,000 and maybe millions. And they were like, whoa, dude, that's insane. So a lot of people who studied evolution had these ideas that we do know are true today. And as they proposed them, a lot of people around them were like, you are literally crazy. And so this was really a risk-taking endeavor to study evolution and put these ideas out there. And again, we know that the Earth is over 4 billion years old. So, you look at it now and be like, oh, 6,000, that's nothing compared to what we know. But that was crazy back then in the context of the time.
Is it Dupont or Lyell?
Oh, yeah, that's Lyell. Thanks. Sorry about that. You're the first person who has ever noticed that. Thank you.
Right.
The next person who studied evolution was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Lamarck had a really crazy idea that is good. Well, no, actually, this one's not the crazy one. So one of his ideas was adaptation, that organisms with the best traits in the environment survived easier than those that didn't have the traits that were best in the environment. And so this is something that we do know is true today. Here's this crazy idea. The inheritance of acquired characteristics. So what Lamarck proposed was that if, when I was pregnant, if I dyed my hair blue, I acquired a different color of hair, blue hair, my baby would be born with blue hair. Could that happen? No, because we know genetics plays a huge part in inheritance, right? So you cannot pass on an acquired trait to your offspring. If I wanted to have orange eyes so bad and I wore orange contacts, it does not mean my offspring are going to have orange eyes. It doesn't work that way. Whatever my genes and my partner's genes deem as the characteristics, that's what my offspring are going to have. So this one was a little wacky. So here's kind of like a ladder of the most important ideas in evolution. We're going to focus a bit more on these two, Darwin and maybe the lesser known Wallace, but these two are about equally as important in terms of the study of modern evolution at a time when people were not quite ready for it, and putting these ideas into a sphere of science where other people could really build on that today. So back in the mid-1800s, so think about this. While that sounds like a really long time ago, we're talking about 171 years ago, we went from just understanding that what parents have, they give traits to their offspring, and what traits they pass on to their offspring will determine, based on the environment, whether those offspring are going to have an easy or hard time surviving. And if they have an easy time surviving, those offspring will have the opportunity to also have offspring and pass on those good traits. Or they may give their offspring traits that are not good in the current environment, and the offspring die off, and those traits die off with them. We went from that all the way to cloning, working on cures for diseases through genomics, mapping out the genomes of entire organisms, figuring out how to combat a virus by making a vaccine with RNA. So we have gone like crazy, right? We definitely have a J-shaped curve in terms of ideas and evolution in just 171 years. All right, so this is Charles Darwin. He was born in 1809. Charles Darwin lived in England. He came from a very wealthy family. There was a very distinct class structure. People who had money were of a higher class. When you have money and in a higher class, you can have all the education that you want. Same thing true today, right? So Darwin comes from a rich family. His dad's a doctor, and his dad is like, you're going to be a doctor too. Well, Darwin used to pass out at the sight of blood, and he was like, I can't do it. I cannot treat patients if I pass out every time I see blood. And so Darwin started to study animals and other organisms and document characteristics about them. And so he had these journals and specimens, and he would take them and collect them and compare them and write up papers about them. This is about the time when people had started putting together ships to go and explore the world. Now think about this. At this time, people thought the world was flat. Can you imagine getting on a giant boat to see what's up out there? To see if you fell off the earth? That's crazy. That's pretty brave to do, right? So these people just said, hey man, let's go. Let's see where we go. Let's see what happens. And so these ships, one of the things that happened, because the class structure was so rigid at that time, the captain was a high class and the crew was a lower class. And the captain was so stern on being in his class and only socializing with people of his class that he would not talk to his crew other than bossing them around. The captains went crazy. Because one of the things we do know is, as humans, we need social interaction to not go crazy. That's why COVID has been really hard on people, because we just haven't seen each other. And so these guys would go crazy. So now what they started doing was allowing a naturalist, someone who studies nature like Darwin, to come on those cruises and be a social companion for the captain. So Darwin got to travel on one of these ships, or a few of these ships, and what he did is every time they stopped to look around, explore the world, Darwin would collect as many specimens as possible. He would draw things, he would collect specimens, he would compare things. So he was taking all this stuff with him to study. So kind of an interesting life he had of exploration. The ship that he was on was called the HMS Beagle. It's quite a long adventure. Started here in England, went down to South America, all the way around South America, hit the Galapagos Islands, pretty famous ideas Darwin formed here, go around the Pacific, past New Zealand, Australia, and then around Africa, back over here. I'm not sure why they stopped again. Something was interesting there, and back up to England. So he spent a lot of time, especially, you can see they spent a lot of time in South America studying. And what he found was that there were organisms, especially animals, that looked like the animals they had at home in England, but they were different. And one of the things that he started noticing was that idea of adaptation, that those organisms were different based on what was happening in the environment of those places in South America. So for example, there was a rabbit in England. England's a little bit cooler climate. The rabbit has features to withstand cold environments. So the rabbit had a thicker, denser fur. The rabbit had smaller ears. Having big ears means that you're going to get cold, right? Like if you have really long fingers and you don't wear gloves, what gets cold and irritates you badly when you're outside, right? Your fingers. So any appendages that are sticking off like ears, when they're long in the cold, that's not good. So they had littler ears, very dense fur, a little bit chubbier. When he went to South America, to places where it was really hot, what he found was that the rabbits there were slimmer. They had really sparse fur. The fur was really soft and spread out. And they had really long ears that could radiate heat off the body. And he was like, okay, so what they look like makes sense. They do look alike, but they're different based on the conditions that they live in. He's like, there's got to be something to that, and they've got to be related because they look so similar. So he started to formulate these ideas of adaptation in real life. So he also, based on digging around, he confirmed ideas of Buffon and Lyell, that the Earth was a lot older than what everybody thought, and probably even like Lyell's really crazy idea that it was probably millions at least. He was like, yeah, the Earth is really, really old. And he did that based on studying fossils too. So remember that fossils are remnants of things that are related to organisms today, but they're older versions with different characteristics. And typically we think of fossils as quote unquote rocks, but they're really pieces of what's left in our bodies that are usually harder. So like our bones, for example, they last a lot longer in dirt and mud and can be preserved. Remember also that fossil fuels are fuels that come from the remnants of organisms breaking down in the soil over time. And that's how we get things like oil, coal, and natural gas. So let's talk a little bit about the Galapagos Islands. In the Galapagos, Darwin specifically studied things like finches, are kind of his very, very famous ones, but also studied the marine iguana. This is cool. So if you picture an iguana in your head, you might picture something that's bright green and slim, looks like that. Not a good picture in terms of the color, but really green, right? Slim, sleek head. The marine iguana has a really stout head, very muscular. Look at the size of that neck, right? So it's not sleek, it's strong, it's big, it's bulky with muscle. So let's take a look at the differences between the two of them in terms of their adaptations. While that's loading, the other thing that I wanted to point out was if you look at their heads, you can see a really sleek head, and this has these bumps and spikes all over it. All right, so a little bit about the green iguana.
Dinosaurs have been extinct for 65 million years. But in the jungles of Central America, there's a world still inhabited by prehistoric-looking reptiles. At sunrise, they stir. Green iguanas, dressed up with artificial helmets and extra scales, were once cast as dinosaurs in B movies. They're not, in fact, direct descendants of the dinosaurs, but even so, some scientists now believe that the social lives of the modern iguanas may show us how the dinosaurs behaved.
Okay, so just to give you an idea what they look like. They are herbivores that eat plants, especially they like fruits, nice sweet fruits too, and a variety of vegetables. So that's what they look like. Now let's take a look at the marine iguana. Do you see what they're doing? They're shooting snot out of their nose, and they do this constantly. Did you see the green iguana do that? No. So what happens with this particular species of iguana is that they eat algae. Algae is in the ocean. The ocean is salt water. Have you ever drank a glass of salt water for enjoyment? No, right? You might gargle with salt water if you have a sore throat, and if you drink a little, you're like, oh. We cannot, as living things, tolerate salt in our body. Salt is very important in small quantities for our nervous system, for our muscles, and for other systems, small quantities. If you have too much salt, it can lead to the disease hypertension, which is not good. So we have to really limit the salt in our bodies. Salt can, and one of the main things that it can do is dehydrate our cells, and we don't want to do that. So they have to have a mechanism that when they dive down and they are biting algae off of rocks that are underwater in the salty ocean, they get mouthfuls of salt. Their heads are so big because inside of their heads they have glands that have mucus, and that mucus is secreted to pull the salt out of what they're eating. Then they need to get rid of the mucus with salt in it, and so they shoot it out of their nose. So they're constantly shooting snot out of their noses. The reason why they have the spikes on their head is that while they can use their claws to get the algae, it's probably easier if your mouth is here, just use your head to scrape algae, right? So they go like this and they scrape and then they bite. And so they use those spikes as like a scrubbing agent to get the algae off the rocks. So very different environments, right? One eating fruits and vegetables, one eating algae and spitting snot everywhere. So he saw this and he was like, they're clearly relatives, but clearly live in different environments and clearly have characteristics based on those environments. And so Darwin started to think about that adaptation, the relationship between organisms, and what did this all mean in the grand scheme of things. So again, emphasizing this idea that organisms are adapted to living in specific environments, meaning that those organisms with the best traits in that environment have an easier time surviving, thus an easier time reproducing, passing on those traits, the good traits, to their offspring. And then likely, if the environment stays the same, their offspring with the good traits in the environment will reproduce and pass them on again. And we know evolution is over time, and that is all in relationship to reproduction. Reproduction is a huge part of evolution because it's species going over time, which means generations over time. So this is kind of the more famous study that Darwin does. I wish the iguanas would get out more because I think it's pretty cool.
Have you ever been to Florida?
I'm sorry?
You ever been to Florida?
Yes.
All
Oh, they're everywhere. They're so cute, right? Yeah. So what Darwin saw, when he went to South America, he saw these finches. And I believe there's about 400 species of finches. Midsummer, we usually see them. Finches do that flying like this, that bouncing fly. The goldfinch is very common to pass through our area here. But there's, I think, about 400 species of them. And so he saw a lot of these finches on the mainland of South America. Then when they went out to the islands, like Galapagos Islands, he saw finches that were similar but different based on the characteristics of the environment. And in each situation, wherever he went to a different island or the mainland, in that area of the mainland, he found that the finches had characteristics to make them well suited or best to live in that environment there. The finches looked the same, but they were different. So here, for example, what he saw in different environments was when there was an abundance of large seeds, you would see finches with big, strong beaks to eat the large seeds. When there were things like cactuses that had tiny little seeds on them, you would see a finch with a long, skinny beak to be able to pick off those seeds. If there were tiny little insects, you would see a very precise, small beak, very small, to allow for picking the insects, but also crushing them. Birds don't have teeth, so they do rely on their beaks, and if you have a bigger beak, you're not going to be able to crush as much. So having a small beak would allow you to maybe like crush up those ants a little bit before eating them. And then if there were leaves and other kinds of vegetation, he saw that birds had beaks that had serrations or like scissor up and downs on their beaks to allow them to tear better. So again, Darwin looked at the mainland and said, here's finches. They look like they're well adapted to their environment based on the characteristics of the environment. And then out in the islands, he saw different characteristics. But what he saw were they all looked very similar, all the finches. So Darwin formulated all of these ideas, like what is going on? They've got to be related somehow. So Darwin gets back from his long cruise, and he's like telling all of the other scholars there, oh my gosh, this was amazing. I figured out that there are all these organisms that are related all over the world, and they are similar yet different in evolution and adaptation, and the earth is really, really, really old. And they were all like, oh, I think you need to go see a psychiatrist. They literally were telling him and talking to each other and saying, he's gone crazy. This long cruise has made him go insane. And so because Darwin was kind of shunned by his community, he just kind of like went down into his lab and studied his stuff that he had and wrote papers and just kept quiet. And so imagine that you discover something huge and you start telling everybody and the whole world is like, you're canceled. No way. Would that be just so deflating? Yeah, that'd be awful. So Darwin got canceled for a while. Wallace, about 16 years later, comes about and he starts talking about the same ideas because Wallace had been cruising And he had been collecting and studying, and he said pretty much what Darwin was saying. And people were like, well, Wallace, that is very interesting. And Darwin was like, come on! I said that 16 years ago. But people just, for whatever reason, weren't ready then. So then Wallace and Darwin start to talk to each other. And Darwin is like, dude, I had these ideas 16 years ago. And Wallace is like, well, let's start working on this stuff together and presenting it together. Because you have a lot of data and I have a lot of data, and a lot of data is good. So they started to come up with big ideas. So now we're coming up with really solid foundations of evolution between the two of them working together. And they did again. And here's the other thing that's really important in science is that they both worked independently and came up with the same ideas. And that's really important in science. And this is like things that are going on in the world, and why it is so great that communication is so quick is that a scientist who is in Africa and a scientist who is in Asia and a scientist in North America can all do in their labs these studies, and they start to put things on message boards, or they start to go, I know that these two are studying on the other side of the world, so I'm going to get in contact with them and see if we're coming up with the same things. And you know, instead of waiting 16 years, we could have that in a matter of days, right? Hours, minutes. And so independent research really is great, because then if you are working alone and you come to a conclusion and someone else is working alone and come to a conclusion and you both come together and you're like, yeah, I'm right. That kind of verifies what you've been studying. So this is great. So again, both of them coming up with the similar ideas. Both of them had done extensive traveling. Both of them observing that species are similar, but a few traits are different based on the differences in their specific environments. Fossils over time showing the differences in complexity based on the environment over time. And the Earth, yeah, it's a lot older, right? So in 1858, they go together and present a paper. So they go to a conference, which is very typical of what scientists do, is there's conferences that are specific to certain sects of science, and then you go and you present, and people ask questions, and people come to see what you're doing because they're doing something similar. And so there's a lot of great kind of space for conversations about what you're doing. So they go there, and a lot of people who are studying evolution come, and then things start to go crazy. So the big conclusion that's so important that comes out of this is that species change over time. And it doesn't happen magically. It's all due to natural selection. Environment changes. Who is favored in that population changes. The most beneficial traits due to that change in the environment survive, passed on to the offspring. And you see kind of a J-shaped curve of specific adaptations or genetic variations become more popular in a population over time based on the environment. So there's no magic to evolution. Sometimes the environment changes, no traits in the population are favored, and then that population goes extinct. So we've seen that too. Doesn't mean that environment changes, someone's going to survive. Could go the other way. So we'll talk a lot about what happens too. Okay, so big idea two that Darwin and Wallace come up with, knowing that species do indeed change over time. They named this concept. This is another base of evolution. Genetics is a base of evolution, reproduction, a base of evolution, natural selection, a base of evolution. So, look at the words. Natural selection. Nature selects the most advantageous traits in species that live in that nature. Again, in nature, in the environment, If you as an individual have the best or most advantageous traits, you're going to have an easier time living, an easier time surviving. Survival is based on having a home, food, things, not so many predators, being good at combating disease. So all the things that make it easy to survive, if you have those traits that make it easy to survive, even when the environment changes, you have time for sex. If you have time for sex, you can pass on your good traits to your offspring. If the traits are still good, the offspring can have offspring, and we see the most advantageous traits grow in percentage in the population over time. Traits that are not advantageous mean that you as an individual are screwed. You can't get yourself food and housing, and maybe you can't combat diseases, or maybe you fall to the predators and you die. Or you are just scraping by to survive. If you are scraping by to survive, can you have sex? Probably not, right? You probably don't have time. If you're thinking every day like, oh my gosh, I just gotta evade this predator. I gotta find a home. I gotta find food. You're not like, I'm gonna take a time out. I'm gonna go have some sex. You are not gonna do that. You are gonna focus on survival first. So if you do not have advantageous traits, you are probably not going to reproduce, which means that you're not going to pass on those genes to offspring. The percentage of those non-advantageous traits in the population starts to go down in percentage. So see, evolution, not magic. Natural selection, genes, reproduction, they all go together. So sometimes we call natural selection descent with modification, descending, passing on, going down, and the modifications that happen in a population. All right, so remember again, the finches, different on different islands and different places depending on the environment. All right, so let's look at one question. I don't know if you have that. Do you have that in there? Okay, good. Okay. Yeah, no picture, sorry. Okay, so for example, the existence of species of flightless birds with wings suggests what? So there's a couple of flightless birds, like the penguin doesn't fly, it's good at swimming. The ostrich has big wings, doesn't fly. So take a look at these choices. I'll give you a minute to pick the correct answer. All right, what do you all think the answer is? Good. So the answer is B, right? The penguin probably had a flying ancestor a long time ago, but for whatever reason, they got close to the ocean, and those birds who could use their wings to fly through the water or swim better, so not just using their wings, but also maybe having the ability to hold their breath and go down and swim and come back up and breathe, that whatever was advantageous in terms of maybe holding breath and using your wings to swim, they didn't get eaten by a seal. They had time to reproduce, pass that on, and now we have a whole population that goes from flying to swimming over time. Do you think it happens in one generation? Do you think it happens in 20 generations? Maybe, maybe not, but we're probably talking about hundreds to thousands of generations to see the population go from flying to swimming and complete adaptation in the population. So it's not an overnight thing. Evolution takes a really long, long time. One of the things that tells you the time frame that evolution will happen in a population, meaning like what bulk of genetics are favored now as opposed to 1,000 years from now, is generation time. That makes a big difference. So bacteria, they can reproduce in 20 minutes. They do it asexually, which is very different, but there's a whole, we'll get into that later. So in 20 minutes, they can have a new generation, right? So in a matter of a week, they might have thousands of generations produced. Can they then evolve quickly in a week? Yeah. So that's why it's kind of dangerous with bacteria that we have these antibiotic resistant bacteria popping up, and bacteria who can survive in capsules for hundreds of years with no food, no water, anything. They do crazy things, and they can do it because they can evolve quickly. With humans or birds or larger mammals, reptiles, it takes a really long time because our generation times are much longer. So the generation time will deem how long the evolutionary adaptation period is too. All right, so Darwin and Wallace sat down and they were like, we are going to make 4 postulates. Well, what the heck is a postulate? A postulate's a big idea. Here's 4 big ideas about evolution. Here's what they are. And they both kind of sat down. They agreed these are the 4 big things we need to know. That individuals in a population vary. Look around. Are we a population? We're a population of Homo sapiens. Does anybody look alike? No, you all look different. I know who you all are because you look different. So, individuals, we do know, look different in a population. That's a big idea. Why do we look different? Genetics. We get different genetics from our parents. What are our genetics based on? DNA. Our genetics are based on mutations. You're a mutant. If one of your friends called you a mutant, would you think that was a compliment? I would say, thank you. I know. Mutations, we all have them. They're like what makes all of us different. Mutations make you good, they make you bad in terms of your characteristics you have. So mutations, you know, it's the superheroes. There's a whole series about the mutants, right? They have good characteristics. I want to be a mutant, right? I want superpowers. So mutations are a good, important thing in evolution. We often give it a bad rap, but mutation is very good and very important. It gives variation. The more variation in a population, the better chance when the environment changes that somebody or some group are going to survive. If we are all the same and the environment changes and it doesn't favor us because we're all the same, bye, we're out, no longer evolving, we are extinct. So variation is really, really good. There's another political thing, right? That in the world, talking a lot about differences, and there's a lot of people who say, this is good, we should embrace it. And there's a lot of people who say, no, come on, it's good. Biology says it's good. It's good. Variation differences are good, they're important. The more variation, the better. Come on, the rest of you, get on board. So look at this. You might look at this and say, oh, there's a lot of different species of snail, but these are all the same species, like you and I. Just like we're all the same species, these are all the same species. They just have different colors. We have different colors. They have different patterns. We have different patterns. They have different sizes and shapes, but very similar. Okay, so postulate number 2, big idea number 2. The only way that offspring are made is they get their traits or their genes from their parents. Duh, right? So things that we know. Are most offspring of most species the same as their parents? No, there are differences, right? And again, the differences are good. And so one of the things that comes into play when you have 2 individuals who get together and they make offspring it is a good thing that the offspring are not exactly the same as the parents. Sexual reproduction is really good. Species who only asexually reproduce, they don't get the benefits of variation like we do who only sexually reproduce. They have other advantages because they can reproduce really quickly, and still in quick reproduction, mistakes or mutations can be made, so they benefit from that way and passing on mutations to their offspring, but not as much of a variety as we pass on to our offspring. So sexual reproduction good, parents pass on their traits to offspring, but not the exact same ones. Postulate 2. We know inheritance, right? Inheritance, genetics, DNA, mutation, all those things. Important in this postulate. Postulate 3, big idea 3. Some individuals, they don't make it. They do not have the good adaptations in the environment, so they die. They don't reproduce those bad genes, and they're gone. Their genes are taken out of the gene pool. Usually, not always, but usually the ones that die off and don't survive is because they don't have the most advantageous genes. Not always, but usually. It's one of the things about biology. Not 100% all the time. Darwin said more individuals are usually born and survive than die. So there's another part of this idea is that some of them, if you have really advantageous genes, you may not have one offspring or two. You might have a whole bunch of them. So you add more quickly to the population. Big idea 4. Postulate number 4 says that survival and reproduction are not determined by chance. The environment, your comfort, your genes, your adaptations, they all have an impact on your survival. So if you think about like a population of dolphins, there might be the prettiest dolphin in the population and the most handsome dolphin in the population, but they are not good at getting food. They're just good at being pretty. Being pretty helped their survival? Nah. I mean, maybe in that other dolphins are like, here, have some food, you're pretty, but if they're on their own, being pretty doesn't help you get food. Doesn't help you if a shark comes. Shark's like, you're pretty, I'm gonna eat you anyway, right? So certain traits make advantages in the environment. If you have those advantages, you survive. It is not just randomly by chance who survives. It's all about your genetics, and your genetics are about your ability to survive. And if you can survive, you might reproduce, pass on those genes. So in a population like giraffes, for example, if you have a giraffe who's got a really long neck, which might look goofy in that population, however, giraffes eat a lot of leaves off of trees. If they can get the highest leaves with no one else being able to get up there in every tree, are they going to have the easiest time surviving? Oh yeah, because they could eat lower with everybody else, and then when there's no more leaves, they can go, ha ha, I can get up here. I get these. So even though this might look like a really goofy giraffe, that's a male with a really long neck. The females are like, ooh, will you get me a leaf? You can get more. And they want to all mate with that guy because he can get the food and help them survive better. Maybe that long neck also helps him bat predators away faster. So they're like, so what's cute today in a population may not be what's cute next time. And cute is all about survival. advantageous traits are cute. We go in a weird way with humans, right? We don't do it the right way. Our brains are too weird. All right, so what's evolution? Let's get into the theory, the very specific theory portion of evolution. Evolution is a theory. I go crazy when I listen to a lot of podcasts and a lot of audiobooks, and I'm like, when people say, I have a theory, blah, 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 and I'm like, you have a hypothesis, not a theory. So a theory is something, an idea, that has been tested many, 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 many times by many, 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 many scientists. And everybody comes to the same conclusion. And based on the technology today, that idea cannot be refuted. That's a theory. So if I say, I have a theory that we're going to have a short winter, did the whole scientific community get behind me and say, I agree with you, I have data to support that, and that's a theory? No, it's just me saying a hypothesis. So, again, when we're talking about evolution in terms of a theory, we have a lot of data. Once Darwin and Wallace came out with all of these big ideas, the postulates, then they said things like, yeah, things went from simple to complex, things were modified over time, there were pre-existing organisms, they died, they left fossils, we have studies about that. The proportions of different genes in an environment are based on what genes or traits are most advantageous at the time. You're going to have a higher percentage of advantageous traits than non-advantageous traits. Okay, so all that is data, 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 data. Lots of data about this. All right, so what's a theory? A theory is, again, a big idea that's been tested over and over and over and over by many scientists. Everybody comes to the same conclusion. Nobody can refute or disprove that idea based on the technology we have today. Gravity is a theory. We know that, now I always get that, I can't remember, does it push us or pull us? Push us onto the earth? Pull, okay. So we know that, right? So based on the technology today, we know that gravity is a theory, but what about maybe 10 years from now, some aliens come down and they're like, we have been controlling you, staying on the earth. And then that blows our theory away, right? So sometimes theories can be refuted, but based on what we know today and the technology we have, everybody's like, I can't disprove this. That is evolution. So when someone says, I don't believe in evolution, I always think like, man, you gotta go back, you gotta take my class, I'm gonna teach you. My parents said that to me once, and I always had my computer with me. I pulled out my computer and I gave them a lecture. And they said, nobody ever told me about this. Yeah, that's right, education is important. My parents also said that humans are monkeys. And I said, we are not monkeys. And I pulled out my computer and I gave them another lecture. And they said, how come I don't know this? I said, Mom, Dad, you gotta take my class. I'll give you all this information. Now I'm gonna give them my YouTube and say, watch it all, learn. Take Bio 112, right? So anyway, lots of evidence, 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 evidence. You all are going to look at the evidence in lab. That's what our lab is going to be about. So we're going to look at embryos, and we're going to look at limbs and fossils and skull structure. We're not going to look at biochemistry because that's a whole field that I hope some of you go into and make fantastic discoveries. But we're going to talk about this in lecture. But it's cool.
Point about the theory, so it cannot be disproven, but it can be edited or updated?
Yes, true, exactly. One of the things about the theory of evolution is what we're basing evolution on is the idea that organisms come from previous organisms and that they do adapt or change over time based on natural selection. The part of evolution that is not part of the theory is how did life start? So this portion, and this is where my parents kind of got stuck, right, is that they said, well, I don't believe that life just happened by chance. And I said, you can believe that. Science says, go ahead, believe it. Science has a hypothetical idea of how life started. And so science makes room for however you think life was created, because we don't know. We have simulations that show maybe it happened like this. And so does it leave room for your ideas? Yeah, because that part is not theory. And that's the sticking point, that once you can tell someone like, yeah, science doesn't know either. Like, you can believe how life started, but science believes that this might be the way. And then people go like, oh, okay. So it's more like the things come from other things. Traits change over time based on changes in the environment. Advantageous traits have an easier time surviving. Reproduction is an important part of this. These things support all of those big ideas. The postulates, right? Darwin and Wallace did not say anything about the creation of life in their postulates, did they? No, they didn't. So think about the postulates. We're going to look at data from these areas to support the postulates. All right, so fossils, right? Fossils, rocks. They're not really rocks, they're rocks. We see the remnants of organisms in rocks and soil and mud and things like that over time. We know they're past organisms because they're dead. What we can see is a progression through time of different organisms. And what we have seen is that organisms were small, and then they got big, and they got small, and they were small, 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 and they got big again. It doesn't have anything to do with the size of the organisms. It's all about the environment, what was happening. So remember, it's not about small to big necessarily. It could go bouncing back and forth. It's about advantageous traits. So some of the ways that we have used fossils is not just this. You guys will look at this. This is Archaeopteryx, very famous animal that shows the transition between birds and reptiles, because it had some bird traits and some reptile traits. So it's not just the bones. You'll look at other things, like see this like area here? This indicates feathering. So while the feathers are gone, they have been digested away by something, one of the D&Ds, right? We can see remnants of that. And other things that they look for remnants in the soil around the bones are there any like bits of eggs, like egg shells? We can see the size of an egg. We can see how many eggs an organism might have had in one reproductive period. Feces that got fossilized for some reason. This will tell you, what were they eating? How big did they poop? Bones, of course. Footprints is another good one. You can go to the Field Museum and sit in the giant dinosaur footprint. So that'll tell us a little bit about, well, what did that look like? So I know the bones, but how big was the fleshy part around those bones? That'll tell you. And then impressions of the skin, could be fur, feathers, could be something more leathery in their skin. So they collect all of these ideas to create the pictures of dinosaurs. Now, coloring is a hard one. You can see that change over time too, that they will collect different things that give them different ideas, that a dinosaur might look like that color today, and then later on they're like, nah, I think it was actually like brown. So that can change, and that can be like, people might take like artistic rights over saying what color a dinosaur is, because it may not show up as well as some of these other things. And also, like, if they don't know what a footprint, if they don't see a footprint, they don't know really how big the feet are. Maybe this foot had really long fleshy things here that helped it to stabilize more. Who knows? And the other thing about fossils is that generally, if you know something about the date of different layers of Earth, you can tell how old an organism is. So not only is it just like, it's pretty deep, it's got to be this old, they really look at and study layers of different kinds of Earth to see when things were born. So like, for example, with these three, they can tell the trilobite was much older when the Earth was all full of water. And then when some organisms adapted to go to land, that you have the ferns came about. So this was a land period, or an early land period. And then a couple of layers later, you have the dinosaurs. And then you're not seeing any dinosaurs anymore in the top layers because they were gone 70 million years ago. Okay, so part number 2, skull structure, when we're looking at fossils. Here's humans, here's a modern gorilla. So when we look at all of the different gorillas, monkeys, the primates in general, which humans are in the primate family tree, are we a monkey? No. Are we a gorilla? No. We're different species. And so if I kind of like, when you look at the primate family tree, I'm taking the two most different species and I'm comparing their skulls. So a few things to point out. Okay, one, like obvious things, right? Teeth. We've got these flat teeth. We've got a variety of kinds of teeth. Molars for crushing. They have molars for crushing. We have these canines. These are more for tearing. So we have the ability to tear something off and then crush it down. They have that ability too. They're going to fight more for their food, right? You don't go outside and like see the squirrel and you're like, "Arr, arr," right? You don't have to pierce the squirrel to kill it with your teeth. So because we don't have to do that, our canines are far smaller. They have big canines, but the rest of the mouth is very similar but very different. When you take a look at other features in the gorillas in comparison to the humans is the jaw size, because again, they're doing more biting and tearing and chasing. If you had to bite and tear off the head of your squirrel, you better have a really strong, big jaw for that. We don't have to do that, right? I gotta drive up, order my food, and I can eat my little thing, eat my French fries. I don't need a big jaw for that, but they don't have a drive-through, so they have to tear and rip, and so they need a big, strong jaw, big teeth to help them. One of the things that I like to look at, and what I encourage you today, when you take a look at different organisms in the lab, is look at what takes up the most real estate, meaning what's the biggest, and think about why that feature might be bigger, or what's small and why. So like the bird beaks, right? If you have a big beak, it means that you're doing a lot of that ripping, tearing. If you have a really teeny little beak, it means you're eating teeny little things. So think about real estate and why. So in the gorilla, the mouth takes up a lot of real estate on the skull. Does not on ours. What takes up a lot of real estate on the human? The brain, yeah. This takes up a lot of the real estate. We're smarter. I don't know, again, I can argue that one. But we have this big thinking brain in comparison. Very small brain takes up very little real estate on the gorilla head. Because they are chasing down their food more, they have this brow ridge, and it's like super eyebrows with a bone in it. Protects the eyes a little more. We have a very small brow ridge, right? You can feel your brow ridge is really small. Oh, sorry. Our jaw doesn't stick out. We have a flat face. They have this big snout. We don't have a snout, right? We have a very small face, flat. All right, so again, brow ridge. You can see we barely have one. in the different primates. Larger primates, they get bigger. I want to point out too, this hole in the bottom of the skull is called the foramen magnum. It's the insertion of the spinal cord into the head. So that, what you really should think about when you're taking a look, because you will this week look at the position of the foramen magnum on different species, and what you're going to look at is when you're looking at the position of the foramen magnum, you're going to think about posture. So humans, ours is right underneath our skull, right? So that's why we stand upright. Our head is level, our chin is level, and our foramen magnum is here. When the gorilla chin is level, they're like this. My foramen magnum position is angular now. So theirs is on an angle. The turtle, it's like this. Their foramen magnum is going straight back into their head. So as you're doing this, when you're looking at the organisms and you are told to draw profile of the skulls, think about the position of the animal. Be the animal. If you have to be a chicken to figure out the position of their foramen magnum is on an angle, then be the chicken, be the turtle. It will help you to realize, is it like that? Is it on an angle or is it upright? Your drawing only has to be as good as mine. Simple, right? Do you get the gist? Yeah, that's what I want to see. I mean, some of you are very talented drawers and I will be like, whoa. But for those of you who are like, I can't draw, if you tell me that all during lab, I'll say, do your best. And I'll say it again and again every time you say I can't draw. Because I can draw. Simple. The point of you guys doing these labs is I want to see that you understand the material. I understand the material. I want to see that you understand it. So remember in your labs, when I say be thorough in your explanations, that means you need to tell me you understand. Couple of tips: do not use ambiguous words. Don't use the word it, ever. Take it out of your conversations, out of your writing, especially out of your writing. Just make this a rule of thumb. Never again, after today, should you use the word it when you are writing, whether it's this class or another class. Because I don't know what you think it means. I might infer, but maybe I infer wrong. I want to see clearly that you understand what it is. So don't use it, because I will cross it off and I will take off points. Don't use they, them, their. Who's they? They. I don't know. I don't know which they you mean. The human, I like when it says they showed it was important because it was important to them. What? Who's they? Who's the other they? Who's the them? Who's the two its? I don't know. You don't know what you're talking about as far as I'm concerned. Or you don't know how to communicate, and that's important. So simple drawings in lab, it will tell you to draw one arm, one. Just draw one. Don't draw the whole organism. Draw one. So I just want to get through just a little more. Okay, brain, we said the brain, bigger brain, right? This is the human brain in comparison to the gorilla brain. You'd probably think it was different because the gorilla skull is so big, but that's the human brain, that's the gorilla brain. we be smarter? Okay, I just want to go through the limb structure. You guys are doing so good. All right, so we're going to compare anatomy, comparative anatomy, comparing anatomy of different organisms. Right, evolution's not fast, especially when we're talking about the vertebrates. Anybody who has a backbone like you and I, it's really slow because our generation times are long. So it takes a long time. Organisms that have more related or similar characteristics are more related or similar. So genetically, we are more related. But depending on the environment that an organism is in, certain characteristics are favored in that environment. So the percentage of advantageous traits is higher and non-advantageous traits is lower. It's like if you decided you were going to join a flock of birds, would you live? If the birds were like, we're going to go up to the top of this building and then we're going to fly to the next building, are you going to pass on any traits to anybody? No, you're going to die, right? So you can't just like be advantageous because you want to join in. You got to be advantageous in the environment. All right, so we have what are called homologous structures, HOMO. In biology, HOMO, homo means same, similar. If you're homosexual, you date someone who is the same sex as you. Hetero means different. Hetero, you date a different sex than you. Okay, so HOMO, it's a good one. You see that a lot. Similar structures, not the same exactly, show evolutionary relationships over time. If you have a similar structure, you have a common ancestor. So you come from an ancestor, and then you go in this environment, and you are favored in a certain way, in this environment favored differently. So everybody who has a common ancestor goes into different environments, and they're a little bit different. The forelimbs of vertebrates are an example, a really good example that you're going to study in lab of homologous structures, the forelimb. We have the humerus, we have the radius and ulna. The carpals are the wrist. The metacarpals are these bones here, and the phalanges are the fingery things. So again, be the animal. Carpals are wrist. Where does the chicken bend? If I'm the chicken, this is my humerus, which is closer to my body, my radius and ulna, my carpals to my wing here, okay? So make sure you figure out, this is carpals or wrist, and then phalanges are the long fingers. Sometimes with some of the, like the bird, for example, where the carpals and the metacarpals and the phalanges, they kind of blend together a little bit. Just do your best to, I want to see like phalanges, metacarpals, carpals, the radius and ulna, specifically labeled, and the humerus. So just, do your best on that. Okay, so, size and shape of the bones tells you a bit about where they live. We are showing divergent evolution. Divergent means go away. Everybody is diverging or moving away from the characteristics the common ancestor had. So we're going common ancestor here, and everybody's moving away toward their environment that they're in. So this is a nice illustration that you have that'll help you a lot in your lab. And you're going to look at the actual fossils too, so that what you're seeing is the bones, and they have them highlighted. And you can see that these are what the bone structures would look of flying animals, swimming, look at that. They look really similar to ours, right? But that's a flipper. So the fleshy part, very different, but the bone part, very similar. Okay, so kind of interesting. And then running, imagine being a dog, right? If you were a dog, would it be beneficial to have individual phalanges like we do? That would hurt after a while if you had to walk on your fingers, on your front and your back legs. That would hurt. So they have more of a bent and fused, and especially sheep who run a lot, they have fused their phalanges and their metacarpals into a hoof. And that makes it easier, so very different. All right, last couple concepts. Vestigial structures, you might call it vestigial, that's fine. Vestigial structures are structures that are similar and commonly related organisms, but in certain organisms, we don't need them anymore. So they have no purpose anymore. Our appendix is one. Our wisdom teeth, anybody have no wisdom teeth? You are highly evolved. Yeah, if you have 4, I have 4. I'm lowly evolved because I had to get them removed, right? Our wisdom teeth were an extra set of molars, and we don't need them anymore because, again, we're eating dainty food now, and we don't need to do that much crushing. And so what they do is when they come in, they push all of your other teeth forward, and they can mess up your whole tooth structure, so you got to get them out. So Haley, who has...
Actually, I didn't have that one. I had 3, but this one I didn't.
Oh, well, she's somewhat evolved then. She was honest. She was like, well, I'll be honest about it. So, hey, not having 1 is better than me having 4, you know. So 1 less thing to be removed out of your head. They do show a relationship. They show that we needed them just like that thing we were related to needs them today. So like gorillas use them, we don't. So us having that last molar and them having that last molar shows we're related. Whales used to have pelvic bones because they were related to something that walked on Earth. That's not selected for anymore. Legs would cause a lot of drag.
So the theory about whales losing more percentage of their brains than humans, is that like true?
That whales are related to humans?
No, them like using a higher percentage of their brain.
Oh, yeah, because they're a mammal. They're a mammal also. So yes, they are. A lot of studies about their, especially their social systems, are very similar, and their language, things like that. Yeah, that they do use a lot of their brain. They also have to dive for like hours at a time. That's pretty smart, right? That's a pretty big survival tool. Nice. So like a whale. So if you've got 2 whales and you have a female, and she's like, this guy, he's smooth in the water. We call that hydrodynamic. He can swim fast, swim away from predators, get his prey quick. That's cute. This guy, he's slow because his legs are dragging, right? So over time, having legs not selected for, but what we do see with the cute guy, he still has those hip bones in his body, but he doesn't have any legs. So it shows us that this vestigial structure, that whales were at one time related to something that walked or ran or etc. We can see that with some snakes have hip bones. Some whales have hip bones, but we know hip bones support legs, right? We have legs that our hip bones come off of. And see your wisdom teeth? If that fully comes in, it's going to push all these forward. That's why you get out your wisdom teeth. Last concept. Sometimes unrelated species have similar adaptations. So are they related? Well, everything's related somewheres, but closely related, no, probably not. We call these analogous structures. An analogy says, this is kind of like that, but not really. So homologous, same or similar. Analogous, not really. They do not have a common ancestor. So if you have an analogous structure, you are not necessarily related. All right, so this is a wacky kind of thought about evolution. So if we think about like dragonflies have wings. However, dragonflies have no backbone. Dragonfly wings are 2 cells thick. 2 cells, they're really thin. There's no bones in the dragonfly wing, right? No bones. Birds, they fly. They have a whole set of bones like we do. Birds are more related to us than the dragonfly is related to the bird. Dragonfly and bird are analogous. Bird and human are homologous. So the bird and the dragonfly, so this is wacky. They're showing convergent evolution. They're evolving toward each other because they both fly. Right? Converging, coming toward. So they're evolving toward each other. They're getting more similar over time. Okay. So see, both fly, but the wings are very, very different. Composition, 2 cells thick, no bones. Composition, wings with bone structure inside and feathers. So very different compositions. And we'll stop there. Thanks for hanging in there, you all. All right, so I'll meet you down in lab. If you all can make sure you wash your hands for 20 seconds before you go in, just for your own health and safety.